Thank you. I'm going to be talking about a little bit about the whole notion of comorbidities in general. That's where I'll begin. And then I'll be talking specifically about three particular types of comorbidity: learning disorders, mood disorders, and Asperger's disorder. But we'll be glad to entertain some questions about other things that may be related to that. One day I was giving a talk on comorbidities and somebody stopped me very early on and said, isn't it dreadful that you have to use that term? It sounds so morbid. All that is medical jargon for having more than one problem at a time. But it's an important thing to be thinking about in terms of ADHD, because although ADHD is in itself a very complicated disorder, as I tried to sketch out in my earlier talk, in over half and closer to 70% of cases, ADHD is complicated by one or more additional psychiatric or learning disorders. So it's not only possible to have another disorder with it, but it's 6 times more likely over the course of one's lifetime. But when you read things about comorbidity, it's important to understand that there are several different ways in which that term is used. Sometimes it's cross-sectional, which simply means is the person having any other disorder within the past 6 to 12 months? Other times it's lifetime. Have they ever in their lifetime had another psychiatric disorder? Now that particular distinction is an important one, because think about it, if somebody is in university and they go through a year when they were smoking too much marijuana, we might say that they would qualify for a diagnosis of a substance abuse disorder based on that. If then you are talking about lifetime and we're looking at this person at a time when they're, say, 45, they would still be classified as having had in their lifetime a comorbid substance use disorder, even though they may have had no problems with substance use for 20 years. So that's the kind of grain of salt that you need to put into this. There are some others that are dynamic, which simply means waxing and waning. For example, obsessive compulsive disorder, sometimes it gets better, sometimes it gets worse. And it depends on when you're looking at the person, whether they're in a period when they're under a lot of stress or they're having a lot of difficulties. That's the same thing is true, for example, of recurrent mood disorders, where a person may be having a very bad episode of bipolar disorder, mania, and then be getting along pretty much okay for a number of years, and then may slide into a depression. And then the other thing which I think often is overlooked is the notion of subthreshold disorders. And what that means is that there are some of these disorders where, according to the manual, you're supposed to have, say, 3 out of 5 or 5 out of 7 symptoms, and the person may be 1 or 2 symptoms short. These symptom counts are really kind of absurd, because the fact is sometimes 1 or 2 symptoms can be big-time trouble. And you may have a little bit of trouble with a bunch of them, and that may not be so much trouble. That's where you get into the impairment. Many times people have, for example, anxiety symptoms which make a lot of trouble for them, even though they may not fully meet the diagnostic criteria for that disorder. So when you're reading about or thinking about comorbidity, it's important to think about which kind are we talking about. Many of you are probably familiar with this diagram. It refers to the 579 kids who were enrolled in the MTA study that was conducted in the US some years ago. And all this is trying to say is that with these kids, all of whom were basically first and second graders at the time that they were taken into the study, all of them had combined type ADHD, carefully diagnosed. And the big circle that you see there, that tan circle, represents the whole population of the 579 in that sample. And then you see the large circle that says 40% on the right. That's the portion of kids in that sample who also had oppositional defiant disorder, which is defined as kids who live with their middle fingers up. And then the circle which is down toward the middle bottom, where it's 34%, that means any anxiety disorder. It could be separation anxiety, it could be a generalized anxiety disorder. 14% is more delinquent behavior, and tic disorders, 11%, and you see a very small 4% with mood disorders. look at how the circles overlap and take a look at how many of these kids had not 2 disorders, ADD plus one other, but in some cases 2 and 3 additional disorders. These are kids who are all in the 6, 7, 8-year-old range. Now, if you were to do the same thing with a group of adolescents, you would see a much larger proportion of kids diagnosed with depression. If you were looking at kids with predominantly inattentive type, you'd see much less oppositional defiant disorder. They didn't include any inattentive in that MTA study. But you'd see more of the internalizing disorders, so-called. So the point here is 70% of these kids diagnosed with ADHD very early, 1st and 2nd grade, had at least one other psychiatric disorder for which they had met full diagnostic criteria within the year preceding their admission to the study. They're complicated. But this particular study did not include learning disorders at all. It selected only combined type. It's purely cross-sectional within the last 12 months, and it's all 7-year-olds up to 9-year-olds. Now, this is a study that was done with adults in the States, and they got a sample of adults with ADHD. This is an epidemiological study, so they were going around knocking on doors to try to get this. And it looks like a complicated batch of numbers, but here's the way it worked. They all had ADHD to start with. And then the question was, did you have any mood disorder, which would include depression or bipolar, any anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, etc., any substance use disorder, it could be alcohol, could be marijuana, could be opiates, any impulse disorder, that's defined on the slide there where they're clumping a bunch of things together, and then the bottom line is any of the above, and the first row is within the past year. And then you move over, this is the percentages, so it's like 25.5% of these adults with ADHD, a quarter of them, had had some kind of mood disorder for which they met diagnostic criteria within the past year. And then if you move to the right, lifetime, how many reported that they'd had something like this at some time in their life? Now, the OR column in each case refers to odds ratio. And an odds ratio of 1 means it's the same as the general population. Because obviously with data like this, the question is, well, yeah, that's high, but is it any higher than in the rest of the population? And this is telling you that for any mood disorder within lifetime, when you get 45% of the people reporting that they have a mood disorder at some time in their life, that's 3 times what you would get if you took the same information in the general population. Now drop down to the lower right corner of the columns where the yellow arrow is, and you'll see that what this is telling us is that according to these data, if you have ADHD as an adult, by the time you're 45, you've got 6 times the likelihood of having at least one other psychiatric disorder at some time in your life. So the question is, what the hell's going on here? Limitations of this particular approach to comorbidity, it included any disorder at any point in the lifetime. So that person who's 45 who had a substance use problem for a year back in university would still be counted as having a substance use problem. Included only 18 to 44-year-olds, which means that some of these things which may get a little more frequent as you get older, not included. Doesn't include learning disorders, and most importantly, it's based on self-report of do you have this symptom, this symptom, this symptom, this symptom. It does not pick up on the issues of impairment. That's a clinical diagnosis. But the question, even if these numbers are not exact, and they probably aren't, it'll give us some idea that lots of folks with ADD have something else going on besides that. And so the question then is, why are there such high rates of comorbidity between ADHD and so many other disorders? Why is it that an adult with ADHD is 6 times more likely to have at least one additional psychiatric disorder at some point in his or her life? I would propose to you that it's primarily a problem with our diagnostic system. And that's because it operates on what I would call the fruit salad theory of comorbidity. And what that means is that in the diagnostic manual, the DSM-4, Each one of the over 200 different disorders that's described is dealt with as though it's a discrete entity, like it's a separate tree producing its own fruit. And then comorbidity in that model is just seen as, well, if peach tree happened to be next to an apple tree, one fell here, one fell there, and you've got a fruit salad. There's no recognition of the degree to which these disorders overlap with one another, or that many of them are hybrid variants. And I think that when you start looking at these numbers, which seem so ridiculously high, it's important to take a look at it. May not be that these people are just so unlucky. It may simply be that the pigeonholes we use to categorize diagnoses are not adequate for dealing with the way in which the diagnoses overlap. Bruce Pennington at the University of Denver wrote some years ago on this issue. He said, you know, these disorders, these little categories of disorders that we use, are really not so separate. They're like regions with fuzzy boundaries in continuous multivariate space. And what's going to distinguish the different disorders is just the weighting, how much you have of different risk factors. It's not that each one has its own distinctive set of risk factors, and then the different epigenetic and developmental interactions that result from that. In other words, these are fuzzy boundaries, and they overlap more than people say. And so what I'm proposing to you is that if you begin to look at ADHD in the way that I was talking about this morning, which says ADHD equals developmental impairment of executive function, and that if we are going to understand executive function not as something that's measured by these neuropsychological tests, but rather as what ADHD is, so that 100% of people who have ADHD by this model are impaired in their executive function, then you begin to see a very different way of looking at comorbidity. Because these executive functions cross-cut the boundaries of different disorders and brain structures and the boundary between pathology and normality. That ADHD then is not just one more of the 211 different disorders in the manual, it cross-cuts the other disorders. Because you see, as Antonio Damasio, who's a neuroscientist in La Jolla, wrote about, he said, you know, without basic attention and working memory, there's no prospect of coherent mental activity. Or Joaquin Fuster at UCLA, he said, you know, attention serves all the other functions of the mind. So what I'm proposing to you is that ADHD is not like some software package, say for example Excel, on your computer, that if it screws up, is going to screw up your calculations that are being done on spreadsheets, but it's not going to mess with your Word or your PowerPoint. That the functions of Word and the functions of PowerPoint are relatively independent of Excel. What I'm proposing instead is, so you could think about all these different disorders might be like different applications, different packages, different sub-programs that each do a sort of package of functions within the computer, for the computer. What I'm proposing to you is that ADHD is not just one of those. It's like the operating system of the brain. That having a problem with ADHD is more like having a problem with your Windows system, which is going to screw up a whole bunch of other programs, and not simply a problem with that one narrow little function that happens to run Excel or Word or PowerPoint. Now, these different disorders vary in their time of onset, when they come on, how long they last, how much trouble, whether they get better or worse, to what extent the other things are going to make them better or worse. But this now is the model which I'm proposing, that we think about ADHD as developmental impairment of executive functions, and that ADHD is not just one disorder among many, it's a foundational disorder that increases the risk of other disorders. Let me give you a parallel. In the measurement of intelligence that we do with IQ tests, it's been demonstrated again and again that there is a general factor, which is often referred to as the G factor, which are basically core abilities. And then there are other specific mental abilities. Or let's talk about emotion. Don Pfaff at Harvard has written about how all emotion involves a generalized arousal level, that there's something going on that gets one activated. And that you can think of as like, if you think in terms of vectors, that's like the vector amplitude. How much is it amped up? And then there's the specific feeling and object, which you think of as the angle of the vector. You know, a person's getting really amped up because they're excited and something good is happening, or they're getting really amped up because they're really getting angry about some person and some event. Those are different directions, but in both cases, you get the amped up if we're going to talk about it as an emotional reaction. Now, I'm just using these as parallels because the place it leads me to is to suggest that psychiatric comorbidity, having more than one problem at a time, involves both a general level of executive function impairment, which you could say is, sort of the ADD stuff, and some specific impairments in particular domains, which might be information processing, arousal or motivation, or social emotional regulation that differ from executive function in quality or in degree. More on that in just a second. So Kessler, when he wrote about the study that I just showed you, that 6 times more likely study, raised 3 questions. He said, can effective treatment of ADHD in childhood or adolescent reduce the risk or severity of comorbid disorders? Answer, yeah. We've got several studies that show us that if you have a child who has ADHD, you can forecast very early in that child's life that they have double the risk of having a drug or alcohol problem at some point in their life if they're not effectively treated. Double the risk. That's just the way things shake out. Doesn't mean for sure it's going to happen, but it's twice the risk of other kids who don't have ADHD. That they'll at some point have a problem with drugs or alcohol that's severe enough to warrant a diagnosis. We now have several studies here and also in Germany which indicate that if you treat the child with ADHD effectively with appropriate medication, you reduce that risk at least through adolescence back to where it would be for a kid who did not have ADD. So yeah, if you do treat these impairments early on, you may reduce some of these possible comorbid disorders. Kessler's second question, does comorbid ADHD account for some of the impairment that's associated with other disorders? Answer, yeah. Processing speed and working memory, the impairments that I was talking about during that high IQ talk a little bit earlier this afternoon, impair learning to read and reading comprehension, whether you have an ADHD, whether you have dyslexia or reading disorder or you don't. So if you don't straighten that out, you're likely to see some other problems. We've talked, I'll talk in a few minutes about the overlap between those. Third thing, can effective treatment of ADHD in adults reduce the severity or persistence of comorbid disorders? Russ Barkley and I published a paper a year or two ago about unrecognized ADHD in adults with other psychiatric disorders. A lot of adults go in to see psychiatrists saying, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, things aren't going very well, and many times will be treated for that and the usual treatments don't work. And it's because many psychiatrists do not recognize yet how to assess and diagnose and treat ADHD. They've been trained to be able to assess and treat depression, anxiety, substance abuse, OCD, psychotic reactions, mood disorders, but most of them have had very little training in how to recognize, understand, and treat ADHD in adults. It just isn't covered very well in the medical school psychiatric curriculum. And what we've learned is that when they do recognize that often if you treat the ADHD in somebody who's not responding very well to the usual treatment for anxiety or depression or some of these other things, often it helps. For example, for years there has been a literature in the treatment of depression in adults which says if you try the usual medicines for depression and the person doesn't seem to respond very well to them, try treating with some stimulants, not just with the SSRIs. Well, they would say they're augmenting the effectiveness of the SSRI. I would say they're treating the underlying ADD, which may not be recognized or diagnosed. And we also have data which suggests that if you've got somebody who's been a drug addict or an alcoholic, and they're able to clean themselves up so that they're not continuing to use heavily, we know that there's a very high risk of relapse from that substance abuse problem back into using again. Most of the people who are treated for substance abuse relapse, most of them, about 2/3. But we also have some data that suggests that if this person has ADHD type symptoms and you treat them with appropriate medication, they have a better chance of being able to sustain their recovery. So the answer to this third question from Ron Kessler is, yeah. If you effectively treat ADHD in adults, you may reduce the severity or the persistence of comorbid disorders. So this diagram is just a way of saying, look, that arrow at the bottom is the main point. That you've got all these other disorders that we recognize in there are different ways of clumping them. This is just the way I put it together. But my point is that all of these disorders have some elements of executive function impairment associated with it. And so it makes sense to me, at least, that if the person is having these other difficulties, it might be worthwhile to at least consider the possibility that treating the executive function impairments may improve the chances of their being able to recover from these other problems. But of course, we have to recognize that it's also true that every one of these disorders, including ADHD, comes in small, medium, and large, which is to say that the severity of the impairment, there's some people who've got a little bit of this stuff, it doesn't make much trouble for them, and there are others who are whoppingly huge impaired and it really messes up their life. How is it that the ADHD increases the risk? Well, sometimes having the ADHD exposes you to other risks. For example, there was a study that was done on junior high school kids, and they were interested in how poor school achievement might be involved in ADHD as possibly a reason why a lot of kids in junior high with ADHD have elevated risks of marijuana use. And what they found was that the process seemed to go something like this. You're reasonably smart, average or above average, you have ADHD, and you get so you're not getting your work done, you're not doing very well on the tests, and pretty soon in those courses where they track kids, where there's like an honors track and then a little lower track and then a lower track and then the who gives a damn track, that very often what happens is that kids with ADHD may start out on average or even above average track, and if they're not doing very well because their ADHD is not being treated, they get dropped from one track to another and pretty soon end up in lower track classes where nobody gives a damn. You know, the teachers often are sort of frustrated and nothing much is going to happen. The kids are selected because they're not able to do very well. Where do you think you find the highest incidence of substance abuse in a junior high school population? The low track classes. You know, and that's an example of where the ADHD, if it's not adequately treated, may lead a person into a peer group that then is not only less motivated for school, but has a higher exposure to substance abuse. That may be a factor. And then we also know that there are some genetic impairments associated with ADHD which might be associated with higher risk for other genetic problems. For example, the Denver group did a study on reading disorder and found that genetically ADHD and reading disorder have some common genetic risk factors. What do you think it was? Processing speed, slow processing speed.